Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here, and a quick take to kick off your week. Of course, what everyone is talking about today, all the leaders, not just the Ukrainian President Zelensky, but all of the key European leaders joining him to visit the White House and talk about the future of the war in Ukraine. Such a different place that we are in today than back in February when Zelensky came to the White House by himself, was unceremoniously booted without lunch. Trump said he didn't have the cards. He's got a lot more cards today. He's got more cards today in part because he has done a lot of work to improve his relationship with the American president, to accept a ceasefire with no preconditions, which Putin has not done, to accept a critical minerals deal that the United States was pushing for to provide some skin in the game for the Americans who weren't just continuing to throw, as it were, good money after bad, as Trump and his advisors would put it, but instead showing that they were willing to have the Americans invest in them over the long term. But not just that, also because U.S. relations with Europe have improved significantly from the beginning of the Trump administration, from when J.D. Vance, the vice president, also back in February said at the Munich Security Conference that the Europeans were the problem. Now the Europeans, many of them have developed pretty good relations with Trump. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer speaking with Trump weekly, pretty friendly conversations that he's managed to build. Alexander Stubb from Finland, Giorgia Meloni from Italy, and of course the new NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, all of whom developing pretty decent working relations with President Trump. And they're all coming together at a time when the Europeans are stepping up their own defense spend, also stepping up their willingness to provide direct support for Ukraine. Far more support coming from the Europeans to Ukraine now than coming from the United States. The U.S. is still essential, lots of critical enablers, lots of weapons being sold, lots of intelligence being provided, coordinated, but this is clearly a NATO effort. It is a transatlantic effort, and that relationship today is stronger, considerably stronger than it was back in February, and nothing represents that more effectively than all of these leaders on very short 48-hour notice, changing their schedules to all fly together to be with Trump at the White House. Now, the importance of this meeting is that it helps coordinate an allied, unified position on Ukraine. It gives Zelensky more strength, more cards to use against Putin, because ultimately the question is Putin going to be prepared to accept an end to this war? And thus far, he's been unwilling to negotiate that, unwilling in part because he thinks he can gain more land militarily. He can outlast the Ukrainians, and he may lose a lot more people, and he certainly is, but he's got a lot more people to lose. He also runs a dictatorship as opposed to a democracy in Ukraine, and Zelensky has a much harder time raising troops in that environment. It's also a much smaller country. There is some progress. That progress most significantly that the United States and Europe are talking about near Article 5 guarantees for Ukraine. The White House has said to Europeans something akin to what the U.S. provides in South Korea. In other words, if there were an attack by an external power, in that case North Korea, in this case Russia, that there would be a collective response, a direct response militarily, and that would mean troops on the ground, in this case not from the United States, but from other countries like France, the UK, like Poland. The United States would be involved with air support. And that's not NATO. And Trump has been pretty clear and consistent that NATO is not happening for Ukraine, and the Europeans accept that generally, not the Balts, not the Nordics, but generally speaking, Europeans understand that isn't going to happen. That collectively from the NATO countries is a significant move to help ensure that an independent Ukraine will continue to exist and survive. That's very different from saying the war is going to be over. Now, last Friday's meeting between Trump and Putin did show one significant win for Putin, which is Trump has been demanding an immediate ceasefire. He got that agreement from the Ukrainians. He went into the meeting with Putin saying he wanted a ceasefire. Putin said, I'm not giving you a ceasefire. Trump came out saying, okay, I don't want a ceasefire anymore. That probably isn't going to work. Instead, I want a peace agreement, a comprehensive peace agreement, which is much harder to get. And it's easier for Putin to have the Ukrainians blamed in part for not getting to a comprehensive peace settlement, as opposed to a ceasefire, which the Ukrainians are accepting. Putin isn't. He's being blamed for that. And the critical issue for Putin is to allow not only the war to continue, but the blame to be shifted, at least in part, to be on the Ukrainians. That's what Putin wants. And he accomplished that to a certain degree in his meeting in Anchorage. And the Europeans and the Ukrainians are trying to counter that today in Washington, D.C., to say, no, there's a unified position here, and that unified position needs to be accepted by the Russians. So they're still to be blamed, even if it's about a comprehensive peace settlement and not a ceasefire. That's the push and pull. The push and pull, sadly, is not yet about ending the war because the two sides are very, very far apart. The push and pull is about who's being blamed for the war continuing. And for the last few months, that's been almost completely on Putin. And even Trump accepts that, however, reluctantly, which is why he was talking about time to put more sanctions on Russia. And remember, he said first it was 50 days and a deadline, and then 10 to 12 days and a deadline. And no one's talking about that right now. Why not? Because Putin just met with Trump instead in Anchorage, but didn't accomplish very much. Now, as long as there is a comprehensive position from NATO that the Russians refuse to accept, that pressure on Russia is going to return. It will continue. If, on the other hand, Trump ends up with a differentiated position from the Europeans, that gives Putin greater space to operate. And that's the big question coming out of today. Not whether Ukraine will still have adequate support to fight. That's clear. They will. Not whether the Americans are going to walk away. Impossible to imagine that. But whether Putin ends up with more or less space to continue this war, or whether the pressure that had been building from the NATO allies, including the U.S., is going to start to erode. That's what we need to watch most carefully, is how is Trump aligning with or not aligning with the Russian position compared to the Ukrainian position coming out of today's collective meeting. Zelensky, not a favorite of Trump, certainly not a favorite of J.D. Vance, but the Europeans provide an awful lot of cover, and that cover is real because the Europeans are putting their money where their mouths are. For years, the Europeans were underspending in defense, and at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the Europeans were underspending to support Ukraine too. That's no longer true, and Trump deserves some of the credit for that. The Europeans deserve a lot of the credit for that. It gives them a seat at the table that they are now taking. In that regard, this GZERO world that I've been talking about for over 10 years, a world where the United States is less willing to provide leadership and no other country or group of countries are capable of replacing them. Here on Ukraine, you're seeing that the Europeans are increasingly capable and willing, not of replacing the United States, but certainly of meaningfully supplementing and even substituting for a lot of what the Americans had done. Still a team, but a stronger team as a consequence of what the Europeans are doing, reforming the transatlantic alliance to be greater than what it was. And it's important because, of course, the transatlantic alliance remains today the strongest military alliance in the world by far. Yes, there is a Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It is weak, it is diffuse, it is far short of an alliance. Yes, you have the Quad in Asia, undermined by some of the tensions between Trump and Modi right now, but nowhere close to an alliance. And nothing the Russians or the Chinese or anyone else is building right now holds anything like a candle to NATO. And what we're seeing today in Washington is NATO, a reform of NATO, a restructuring, a re-strengthening of NATO that gives Ukraine more of a fighting chance. And that means pushes Putin towards more pressure to come eventually to deal and end the war, which is what everyone is hoping for here. That's it for me. I'll talk to you all real soon.